Welcome to Season 3 of Candid Leadership. Throughout this season, I'm taking recommendations from listeners to speak with leaders and mentors of inspiration. Today's guest was recommended by listener Geo Barker, with a massive hat tip for myself, who delightedly took this fantastic recommendation and ran with it. Listeners, our guest today is Dr. Jay Parker. Dr. Jay Parker is a distinguished professor and Major General Fox Connor Chair of International Security Studies at National Defense University. A retired colonel from the Army who served in the infantry and special operations assignments, and is a professor and director of international relations and national security studies at West Point. He has worked for the Executive Office, Georgetown, is a member of the Council on Foreign Relations, a visiting fellow at Princeton, and an adjunct faculty at Columbia and George Washington Universities. He received a PhD in international relations from Columbia University. Welcome to the program, Dr. Parker. It's great to have you.
It's wonderful to be here.
So admittedly, I am very biased in favor of our guest and his approach to mentoring. And I'm so biased because I have been on the receiving end of his mentoring over several years. And I can attest to the fantastic approach that Dr. Parker consistently weaves throughout, using his knowledge of academia, government, and the military into a truly networked approach to connecting people. I have never met someone with such an expansive list of contacts who also freely works to ensure his mentees stay connected and grow. So knowing that you've done that, Dr. Parker, for so many years, how have you approached the idea of mentoring?
Wow. Well, thank you for that impressive introduction. I'll have to spend the next several years trying to live up to it. My approach to mentoring, I think, is like a lot of individuals who come out of an era before you started to see a lot of formal education and classroom focus and academic publishing on this. I come out of the experience of having been mentored, and I recognize that I was very lucky in that regard. My mentors were absolutely not just those in uniform. I came into the military relatively late. It was my midlife crisis. So I had a couple of other careers and incarnations beforehand. So I've had opportunities to see how other people mentor and how they approach mentoring me. I've also had the opportunity, quite frankly, to fail. And I don't think that can be understated as a foundation for being an effective leader and being a capable mentor. Understanding your own failures and your own shortcomings, because inevitably when you're mentoring individuals, you're going to have to help them through that process as well. So, as you've said in other versions or other episodes of this podcast, there are lots of different variations of what constitutes mentoring. There are formal mentors accredited by national and international associations who have their own consulting business, or who are important parts of professions that have deliberately established mentoring programs internal to those professions. There are institutional mentors, and a lot of that comes from the responsibilities you are given as a teacher, as a commander, as a manager, as a director. And then there are informal mentor tasks and responsibilities that individuals take up. 99.9% of what I have done has been in the heading of institutional and informal. And frankly, a lot of the informal mentoring I've done has been an extension of mentoring that started out as part of the process of being a teacher, being a commander or a leader or director, and then just continuing that on through many months, in some cases years and decades, and being available and attentive and aware of not just the individuals you're mentoring, but the professional environment that they're in and the demands that those place on them. At the end of the day, I think the two most important factors that, at least in my experience, have worked for me, and I didn't come to these automatically, and as I said, there was some trial and error in this, is number one, understanding that mentoring is an extension of listening, of not just you asking questions, but helping the individual you are working with to ask questions that maybe they haven't identified, maybe they're afraid to ask, maybe they ask but never really examined the answer. So it requires a lot of listening and a lot of feedback. Being a directive mentor, you will do this by X date and you will follow this prescribed process and this route of schooling. Sometimes that's required in an institutional setting, but an informal mentor, it becomes very dangerous to kind of take that approach because you're not only limiting what you can do, but you're dramatically limiting the opportunities for the individual you work with. And then the final point is just remember that you're dealing with individuals. And this goes back to something that's been mentioned on a number of your episodes, bearing in mind that you are not creating a mini me, that your experiences, your desires, your demands, your pressures, your opportunities are not ones that you can implant into someone else. You have to really make a constant, continuing, ongoing effort to understand who you're dealing with and what they're dealing with. And everything else kind of stems from there.
I absolutely agree. I can't emphasize some of those points enough. To listen. Again, you have two ears and one mouth is very important. But we, in our experience, and we've talked about this in the past, and that's what makes this conversation so delightful. We've also seen people fail at mentoring. So looking at some of the mistakes that they've made, and a couple that I know I've tried to steer in the right direction, what are some of those clear indicators of mentors who are making a mistake and ways in which we need to start to reshift or reshape their focus?
A very good question. And again, I'll draw on not only mentors I've observed, but some of the failings I've made over the years. The first failing is to forget why you are mentoring. What's the purpose behind this? If you're in an institutional role as a teacher, a commander, or a leader, or a CEO or COO, you have a responsibility to an organization, and you have a responsibility that our organization's missions, its ideals, and you are mentoring because you want individuals to reach their full potential so that the organization can achieve its purpose to the greatest degree possible. And I have witnessed mentors, as I'm sure you may have as well, who lost sight of that, who forgot what it was that was at the core of why they were doing the mentoring. Is this because you want to take on the challenge of just helping someone realize their individual dream without challenging them to examine that dream and without examining whether or not that really is a part of what the organization does? Willing to take the risk of saying, those are all good, those are all noble, but let me help you get someplace else because you can't and probably shouldn't try doing that here. The failure to do that is one of the first major mistakes that mentors make, and that I made a couple of times early on in my career. And then the next one, of course, is the biggest one that we just talked about a second ago, and I'm sure we'll talk about again, is this is the way I did it. This is the way the organization and the institution operated and structured when I was moving forward. The goals and objectives, be they concrete in terms of positions and assignments, or softer, harder to define in terms of self-actualization. This is what was out there when I was moving forward. And therefore, I'm going to assume it's going to be the same for you. And for you to succeed, you have to look like and do like me. That is probably the single biggest recurring failure of mentorship I've seen. And again, it betrays the needs of the individual you're mentoring, but ultimately it betrays the organization. And if you're doing this in an institutional role, you are undercutting the very organization, that an institution that you thought you were setting out to strengthen and advance.
Those are some great points. And I think I want to talk about some of the principles that you've discussed on mentoring. One, you've spoken to already multiple times. Don't create a carbon copy of yourself. But another one is setting up that blueprint, because I think, and especially that I've found, traveling and now living in the National Capital Region, people come here bright-eyed and then they're almost overwhelmed with the number of choices and options, and they almost get into a state of stasis or total shock because they are so locked up with either the number of options, so many people giving them advice on this is what you have to do to achieve this level of profession. When we're looking at those principles, what are those foundational things that you would recommend to people receiving mentorship, aside from take a deep breath, because it's a long journey?
Number one is don't immediately rush out and act on the first thing you hear. It's kind of like doing a Google search. The hit that comes out at the top, just because it's had the most hits and the algorithm sent it to you, may not be the best option. It's certainly not the only option. And sort through what you're hearing, evaluate it not only in what you can observe, but again, step back and say to yourself, where is it that I intend to go? What is it that I am trying to achieve? And constantly ask yourself that, because you'll get great advice that will seem terrific on day one, and it may get you through the first and second week. And then all of a sudden, 6 months, maybe a year later, you realize you're going down a path that may ultimately have some professional rewards, but it's not suited for you. It's not what you started out to do, and it's taking you farther and farther away from what you're capable of and what you probably know you need to do. Brief war story in that regard. I first came to DC as a 20-year-old working on the Hill, and it was absolutely like being thrown into the deep end. There were a wide range of things going on at the time that I found myself being given to work, not because I was an expert, but because nobody else was in the line of sight of the boss when they said, we've got to refine this bill, or there's a hearing tomorrow, or constituents are calling about this issue. And so there was a lot of quick learning. And there were certain things that I discovered I was pretty good at and I could achieve. There were some things that I was decidedly not very good at. And so I backed away from those things. But there was no one initially who was there to mentor and direct. Everybody else was running around with their hair on fire like I was. And so it took a while for me to determine that, number one, I can continue down this path doing these things that are the path of least resistance, but is that really who I want to be and where I want to go? And I can continue to avoid certain tasks and certain skills and certain difficult career moves, but am I just putting off facing up to challenges that I do need to take on? And oh, by the way, and these were in the days when I can't ever remember anyone using the word mentor, where mentors did not present themselves to you automatically. And so I began to build networks and talk to people and folks who'd been here for their entire lives, others who were peers, sometimes just sitting quietly in the back of a room, which is very hard for me to do because I tend to want to jump into the middle of things, and taking notes. And I ultimately realized that if I wanted to get where I wanted to go, or where I thought I needed to go, I needed to leave DC. And I needed to go off and do other things. And a time would come when I would hopefully come back and be able to take on the issues that I thought I wanted to do in the first place. I would be willing to bet that there are lots and lots and lots of people out there who came to Washington or came to New York or came to London or Chicago or wherever, who had a very similar experience. And I say that because a lot of the conversations I ended up having just before I made the decision to leave were with individuals who said, I stayed too long at the fair. It was fun. I got to do the rides, got a lot of cool attention. But here I am, 30, 35, 40, 50, and the train has left the station and my opportunity to do other things are gone. And I have skill set that can only be used in DC. And if I had it to do over again, I would have been open to taking bigger chances and to pushing out of what was a pretty comfortable place and develop from there.
That's phenomenal advice. I really like that. And I bet that'll strike a chord with the audience, because so many people, they're very comfortable and they get to the point where you're close to being an expert at something, but that doesn't mean you harden yourself. I think you've got to learn how to be comfortable with being uncomfortable. Learning how to pivot is so important. And so we're going to pivot this podcast episode for a second. And aside from mentoring, I can tell you, Dr. Parker listeners has both attended, learned, and instructed courses on leadership. And so as we kind of pivot the topic to leadership, We've recently had a discussion on a fascinating study with respect to leadership programs instructed at the collegial level. And I'd like for you to kind of dig into that and some of the findings out of that study.
Sure. And this is nothing I can take credit for. The foundation of this is a truly brilliant individual and a great leader by the name of Tom Kolditz. Dr. Tom Kolditz is director of the Doerr Institute for Leadership at Rice University in Houston. Dr. Kolditz is also Brigadier General retired Kolditz, had a very successful career as an artillery officer, then served the last decade of his career as head of the Behavioral Science and Leadership Department at West Point. A very unusual individual. He had his PhD in psychology before he reported to his first artillery battery as a second lieutenant. Wrote an excellent book called In Extremis Leadership, which I highly recommend, not just to those of the military, but to anyone. After he retired, he went to the leadership program at Yale and was initially struck by how many programs he was interacting with at other colleges that didn't seem to have coherent programs, didn't seem to have evidence-based programs. There was no, ironically, one of the essential skills in leadership is constant self-examination, and yet there were leadership programs that were doing no self-examination. And so he kind of filed that away. The opportunity came in the form of the offer from John Doerr to stand up this phenomenal program at Rice. And eventually he began to start looking formally at all these programs with a couple of colleagues at other schools. And their driving question was, if you take an individual who walks into a class first semester freshman year in leadership, whether it's someone who's a leadership major or some sort of a leadership training program or whatever, and then you compare that individual as they are about to graduate, where are they progressing in skills? Where are they not progressing? What are they prepared to do? Can we draw a template nationwide and eventually globally that says what works and what doesn't work with leadership education? And the shocking thing that they found that he explained to me several years ago when I was visiting down there is that the difference between that freshman and that graduating senior was that much. And for those of you with merely listening at home, I am squeezing my thumb and forefinger together. The absence of measurable, replicable, verifiable results out of these leadership programs was seriously wanting. The good news is that through looking at these programs, they came up with a number of recommendations on how these programs can adapt and fix themselves, how they can be, whether you're a standalone program, whether you are a parallel to an education program leading toward a certain profession, whether it's a non-credit mentoring program that works with students who are in leadership roles in various organizations, whatever it may be. There are ways to go forward, and there are good lessons learned to be picked up. The problem was almost no one was doing this. The book that lays this out is called Leadership Reckoning. Can higher education develop the leaders we need? And the Doerr Institute has as its mission disseminating as broadly as possible the results of all of its studies. And so if you go onto the website, go to the Rice University, rice.edu website, or look up Dr. Kolditz or whatever, it will lead you to a lot of other studies that they've done. Now, I've got to admit, this was a little bit of a surprise to me, but as I thought about it, it wasn't counterintuitive. You and I come out of professional experiences and both training and education programs that not only expect, they demand that the individuals who go through these programs be prepared to take up leadership responsibilities at a very intense level with very high degrees of risk at very, very early ages. And so certain things that you or I would have thought intuitively would be something that an individual going into a leadership position would be prepared to do, whether it's in day-to-day leadership or the long-term process of mentoring, just doesn't happen. I was having a conversation coincidentally today with an individual who served on active duty in the Marines. He's remained in the Marine Reserve. And he was talking about the impact that being a young Marine had on the way he approaches his role now in business and in life. And in the course of the conversation, I mentioned you and I were going to be talking today and mentioned the podcast. And he said, it's even when you are going through an evaluative sort of, let's check the block. It's been 3 months since we did this. I've got to sit you down for 15 minutes and fill out this form, Private Schmidlap or Lance Corporal Smith. That may not seem like much at the time, he said, but when you get out into the business world or other places, it's just not there. You begin to understand why so many organizations, institutions, not just corporate world, but in the nonprofit world, certainly in my current profession of higher education, why a lot of institutions fail, why they stumble from one crisis to the next. And some of them do very, very good at confronting those individual crises. But in terms of long-term vision, long-term imagination, long-term creativity, and being proactive, they fall short. And that Tom and others have done attempt to systematically look at how leadership education can be improved across the board, not just in institutions like military programs where you expect that sort of education, but even in professions where you're kind of surprised to see it happening.
And especially, I'd like the point that you talked to feedback and the criticality of, that leader recalling even 15 minutes set aside once a quarter, that invaluable discussion or tidbit. That's a lifelong lesson that we take as second nature because it's both theory and practice in our world. And if you get too much of one or the other, I really think that inevitable uncoupling occurs. And it's demonstrable in certain sectors and certain areas.
Yeah, there are a couple of things that have to happen. And if you force them to happen, other good things will. For example, if you're going to mark in your calendar, today is the 15th of July, I have to sit down with this individual and do a periodic performance counseling and evaluation, you're also doing a forcing function to yourself. Well, I better start paying attention to what's happening so that I can speak like I know what's going on in my own organization and not sound like an idiot. And it's going to force you to go back and assess the conversations you've had with that individual before. Has progress been made? Was there something that you both came to a conclusion on in terms of this is the way forward and this is something to try, and it didn't work out and you need to redirect? All of those things now should be turning through your mind. And it really does start from day one. I was listening not long ago to the podcast you did about what happens when you come into an organization and what should happen in the first couple of days or week in terms of mentoring. Just one example, the first job I had after I retired, I was senior vice president of a nonprofit. And so I sat down with all the individuals who reported to me and I said, okay, here's what's going to happen. I'm going to tell you what I understand about what you do here and what I am supposed to expect from you. You're going to tell me how far off the mark or how on the mark that is. You're going to tell me what you expect of and need from a boss in terms of not just being able to do your job and getting the resources, but in terms of your own professional development and what you know about the strengths and weaknesses that you have. As a result of that, guess what? We're going to talk about the strengths and weaknesses that you perceive that you have. And we're going to sit down and review them periodically. And we're not just going to say, where do you see yourself in 5 years? Great, go get it. We're going to talk about how you get from here to there. And we'll come back and revisit that often. And they seemed a little surprised, but I just thought it was all part of a new boss coming on board. About 6 or 7 months later, I'm sitting down with one of my senior colleagues going over some business stuff. And I look at my watch and go, I got to take off in about 10 minutes. So-and-so's coming to my office for her quarterly career progression discussion. And he looked at me and said, for what? And I said, you sit down with the individuals who work with you, and what do you do? And here's what I think you do. And here's where the organization goes. All those questions you ask, and the how they're progressing, and what opportunities they need, and new opportunities you've come across you may not be aware of for them. And he kind of looked at me it seemed to me forever, but it probably was about 30 seconds. And he said, I have been in this organization 7 years. No one has ever done that for me. This was a smart guy. This was a good guy who came to the organization without a lot of prior experience, who not only needed, but deserved that kind of attention. Now, the happy ending of the story was about 3 weeks later. I came by his office to talk to him about something, and he said, can we talk later? I'm going to sit down with all the people who work for me, and I'm going to do what we talked about. And so he was moving forward in that direction. But it was another reminder that these principles you would think are intuitive, you would think are inherent in any institution. And not just by going back and reading B school case studies or articles in Forbes, or, those books that you see on the rack at the airport while you're running to a plane, Tough Leaders Survive by Winnie the Pooh, and The Mentoring Secrets of Genghis Khan, or whatever. The material out there and the discussion of this topic does not mean it's necessarily happening. And it certainly does not mean that when it happens, it's happening in a productive way for the individuals involved.
And I think that's something you've always done, Dr. Parker, is really leadership by example. And that drives me to kind of walking backwards in time and how we met. So listeners, I won't reveal our ages, but it's been a while, maybe a decade or two. And you were my instructor at West Point. And so Truth in Lending, it was one of my favorite classes during my 4 years at the academy. It probably demonstrated why I was a unique fit for the school, having never seen a war movie prior to entering into the school. You taught a class on film and military and politics. It does drive to when I got the call for acceptance to West Point for my senator, I was at a Bob Dylan concert. So when I arrived, I fell into a school with a very different mindset than many of my classmates, and that's why I fell in love with this course. It was an opportunity to think both creatively and critically, and to pull from insights from popular culture into the real issues of the military. So what was your motivation to create this course in social sciences, and how West Point helped shape the course that you made on film?
The short answer is I did it on a dare. One of the other faculty members at the time, Karen Lloyd, who went on to a tremendous career in the Army as a public affairs officer, said, you're always talking about popular culture and the insights it provides into politics and the political process. I basically double dog dare you to put together a class and see if they'll let you teach it. And of course, the person who was the decider, someone you know as well, now Brigadier General retired Dan Kaufman, and you could predict that he would not only approve it, but would enthusiastically want to be there for the first day of class. My foundation for the course was that all art, not just film, but poetry, sculpture, music, whatever, provides insights into who we as a collective people aspire to be, what we fear, what we hope for, what we reject. If you look at those works of art and popular culture that were very, very well received in their time, and especially those that have continued to resonate for decades and centuries, it's because it tapped into something, what some scholars call the kind of collective unconscious. And I had in my previous incarnation, or one of my previous incarnations as a psychological operations officer, I had seen that communicating messages and attempting to reach strategic goals through strategic communication meant that you could not take people as kind of empty bowls. You had to realize that people are at a certain place and you need to go where they are, and then bring them to where your message and who they are has a common ground. The way to identify that with various societies and various countries and various populations at various points in history is to say, well, what were they listening to? What were they watching? What were they reading? What were they repeating as myths and legends? What plays were the ones that were performed in ancient Greece or in the old globe or wherever that people came to see again and again? And if you do that, it's a way to more consciously explore who we are politically and who other people are politically and culturally. So that's a very, very long explanation. But I began with the assumption that we wouldn't just take movies that were about the military or movies that were about a political action, Mr. Smith Goes to Washington or The Candidate or The Last Hurrah or Saving Private Ryan or Bridge Too Far. We would look at a wide range of films that maybe revealed broader lessons where you could say, yeah, that actually has a tie-in. And you could use a little bit of imagination and foresight to think, how might this play out? The examples among many that I have from great students who I had in those courses that I've brought back to people later on and said, this is an indicator of how someone took those lessons and took those insights and thought about how an institution like the military or society as a whole might move and what direction they might take. And one of the foremost lessons I bring up is the paper and presentation that you gave on the integration of women into combat roles, which at the time was not only hard to conceive, it was viewed as heretical in some circles. Well, here we are a few days later, and it's an accepted reality. It was, in many ways, as you found out in your research, a reality at the time, but people just had not recognized and accepted it. And that, to me, is an example, to kind of come full circle here, that to me is an example of ways in which a leader and a mentor in their educator role can give people an opportunity to explore something that's important to them, to explore who they are and what they believe and what they value and what they aspire to be. You might read this book. Hey, have you seen this movie? By the way, there's a concert this weekend and I'm going, and I find it interesting that this music somehow relates to what we talk about in class or what we talk about in barracks or whatever. That to me is just one of the tools, an example of one of the tools that you can use to get people to think about leadership and think about service and think about how they develop. Professor, I'm not sure if she was on the faculty when you were there. She may have just been coming in, but she's now a full professor at West Point, Elizabeth Samet, who has written some extraordinary books about reading, about her former cadets and what they got from her literature courses and how they came back to her later and said, this sparked something later on when I was in Iraq or Afghanistan or Bosnia or in garrison or whatever. And I remembered wrestling with these ideas, and here it is in real life confronting me. There are lots of tools that are available to mentors. And in many cases, there are certain common things. Obviously, if you're all in the military and you've all done certain jobs, there's kind of a constrained cluster of there I was stories that you're going to rely on to draw lessons. But there are also broader things that you can bring from your experience in life and in both formal and informal education to make you more of a reflective leader, but also make you more of an effective mentor.
Well, Dr. Parker, thank you so much for this conversation. And it really has come full circle from someone who I've learned a tremendous number of lessons and brought forward ideas. I've been able to parse that and use it in a lot of my own mentorship. To our listeners out there, please look at Dr. Parker's bio, and we'll have the listing of the books that he's mentioned in the show notes for you to check out. Thanks again so much for joining us on Candid Leadership, Dr. Parker. We definitely appreciate it.
Oh, it was my pleasure. Anytime.
That was Dr. Jay Parker, who provided us with an insightful look on mentoring, leadership, and the importance of looking at different places for creativity. I really appreciate you listening to this conversation. And if you want more candid perspectives on leadership, go to colonelcandid.com. I encourage you to sign up for the newsletter, where you'll receive the latest Candid Leadership episode notifications, writings, and links to other great leadership and mentorship content. As we mentioned in the beginning, I'm always up for recommended guests. Season 3 is full of great leaders and mentors recommended by you, the listener. I would also encourage you to share this podcast with your friends, colleagues, and whoever you think could benefit from the information and wisdom shared by my amazing guests. I know I grow with every conversation, and I want to share that experience with as many leaders as we can. This show grows by word of mouth, so be sure to share this podcast. And please, if you think I've earned it, leave Candid Leadership a 5-star review on wherever you find yourself listening to this podcast. Thanks again for joining me. I'm Colonel Candace Frost.